Corruption, this is to say, has real human consequences. Moreover, there seems to be something more than the economist's notion of the self-interest behind corruption. Something more than someone wanting to merely maximize their pleasure or their utility, as the famous economist Milton Friedman would have it. The term corruption connotes a sense of lost morality, and to effectively deal with corruption means moving beyond the economist's moral relativism, or at least the relativism of economists such as von Hayek, to consider mobilizing the greater, common, or shared sense of morality that motivates us all to come here today. To deal with corruption, in short, requires that we think with our reasoned and moral being and discard those terms that move us away from it. Momentarily going back to accounting, I can't help but think that is why accountants avoid the use of the term corruption, because of its moral connotations. Accountants like to think of themselves as objective, neutral, and independent, so this is why I think they prefer the more legalistic term, fraud. Indeed, the other day I was flipping through my latest issue of Fraud magazine, and I noted that numerous acts, such as embezzlement and money laundering, all fall under the rubric of the term fraud. I saw the term corruption mentioned only once, almost as if by accident. Now, I'm not suggesting we discard the term fraud, but I think we do need to more consciously consider that fighting such things as bribery and tax evasion require more than just the backing of law. It also requires, as Aristotle reminded us long ago, and as many remind us today, that we mobilize our moral skill and moral will. In viewing corruption from an orthodox Chicago School economic perspective, which is the predominant perspective in the literature, there's little difference between want and need. But from an alternative viewpoint, one that recognizes that we have a common or shared sense of morality, which is to say our morality is not purely individualistic, there is a difference between wants and needs. To be sure, we are much more sympathetic to people that need to act a certain way than we are to those who want to act a certain way. Want implying a greater sense of individual agency or volition. We're also much more inclined to act when we encounter hunger and violence than we are when we keep the discussion at an abstract level, such as we do when we talk of economic growth. So I was trying to think of a term that better captures the morally repugnant, morally reprehensible nature of the term corruption. I've been trying to find that something. One notion that I think seems to work is the notion of greed. I contend that it is our out-of-control appetites, our gluttony, our lust, and our avarice, our greed, that is what lies behind and motivates corruption. And so I've come up with this relationship. As an alternative to seeing corruption as a function of self-interest and its effect on economic growth, I would like to replace these terms and this relationship and suggest that corruption invokes a relationship that has moral consequences, greed that leads to hunger. The reason I specifically invoke the idea of hunger is because I can see greed not only resulting in hunger, but also hunger becoming out of control, fueling greed, in a cycle, like waves of appetite, hunger, greed, hunger, greed. What do I mean by fueling or feeding greed, you ask? Here I borrow on the work of medical scholar Raymond Tallis, who says that we are basically all motivated by 4 types of hunger. And to his analysis, I would add that when we lose control of our hungers, we act in greedy ways. Of course, we are all motivated by physical hunger, and some are driven to desperate acts to feed themselves and their families. And while hunger can become too much, what was need can also become want. And when the satisfaction of want becomes greed, we witness greed. We're also motivated by the need for pleasure and diversion, and here I would agree with our economists. Feeding this hunger, this hedonistic hunger, is good, worthy, and necessary. But it too can become out of control, characteristically becoming disgusting, excessive, and greedy. Our hunger for social interaction and contact with others is yet another force of driving human action. This hunger often has us thinking about ourselves and how we are perceived by those around us. While we hunger for attention, so too this can become out of control, leading us to not only want the attention, reverence, and deference of those around us. History books are full of examples of people who feed on this, lusting after it, demanding affection, demanding respect, exemplifying greed in the process. Our 4th human hunger is for knowledge and meaning. This hunger moves us to work hard and study and reflect on the big questions such as, what is reality? How do we know it? Do we have a purpose? What is right action? How do we live a good life? And the like. Of course, here too, some are swept away by this hunger. They immerse themselves in thought, losing touch with reality in the process. Thought is often misguided, the idea is corrupted. There are holders deluded into thinking that not only are there concrete answers to many of the questions they ask, but worse, that they are the only ones who have the answers. The point then is that corruption is much more than a function of one's narrow self-interest. Rather, I would argue it is a function of ingrained and seemingly natural hungers gone awry. It is a function of a loss of control over our hungers, a detachment from any ability to understand how they come to consume us, and what the consequences are of continuing to feed or cater to these hungers. And insofar as the consequences involve other people, there are moral consequences. I'll come back to these ideas of greed and hunger in a minute. What I'd like to do now is have us consider that corruption is very widespread, and while it exhibits some universal characteristics, its manifestations are also very much dependent upon context. For those interested in corruption, this map is probably familiar. It shows us where corruption is a serious problem and where one is less inclined to find it. Iraq and Afghanistan are seen as being rife with corruption, Greenland and New Zealand almost free of it. But I think this map is very misleading, because corruption is also rife in the orange and yellow countries. It is just different from the type found in the brown and red countries, which is to say that it is wrong to imagine that corruption is not endemic in the most affluent countries of the world. A recent work by Michael Johnson, published by Cambridge University Press, provides some insights into these differences. For example, Canada typifies what's called an influence market country, meaning that corruption in our country, to quote, involves efforts on the part of private interests to rent access and influence within well-institutionalized policy processes, often through political figures acting as middlemen. This less visible type of corruption is arguably more odious than that found in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, for the simple fact that it is less visible. One would almost think that violations of trust don't occur in our fair country, as these violations go on far away from the gaze of the Canadian public. At least in other countries of the world, the corruption is apparent, obvious, and in your face. In influence market countries, this more hidden form of corruption is made manifest in a number of different ways, and symptomatic of it is a lack of restraint among political and economic elites. Of course, one need not look too far to see examples of lack of restraint.